The evening sun was setting over suburban Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as Mike pulled his worn-out Honda Civic into Giovanni's Pizzeria parking lot. The familiar smell of freshly baked pizzas wafted through the air as he adjusted his name tag and grabbed his delivery bag from the back seat. At 32, he had been delivering pizzas here for 3 years, and every corner of this neighborhood held a story. The small pizzeria, with its red and white checkered curtains and photos of Italy on the walls, had become like a second home. Mr. Giovanni, the owner, always greeted his employees with a warm smile and treated them like family. "Hey kid," he called out as Mike walked in. "Busy night ahead." The phones won't stop ringing. Mike didn't mind the busy nights. In fact, he preferred them. The constant movement, meeting different people, and bringing smiles to hungry customers' faces made the time fly by. Sure, there were occasional difficult customers, people who complained about late deliveries during rainstorms or questioned the prices during peak hours. But Mike had learned to handle them all with a gentle smile and professional attitude. His coworkers often wondered how he maintained such a positive outlook. "It's simple," he'd tell them during their break room chats. "Every person you meet is fighting their own battles. Sometimes a little kindness can make their whole day better." This philosophy had earned him the nickname the Smile Guy among regular customers, and his tips reflected the appreciation people had for his cheerful service. Tonight was a Friday, typically the busiest night of the week. The kitchen was buzzing with activity, pizza dough flying through the air, the ovens working overtime, and phones ringing nonstop. Mike checked his delivery app, noting his first stop would be in Oak Ridge, an upscale neighborhood about 15 minutes away. As he loaded the pizza into his insulated bag, he couldn't help but remember some of his previous deliveries to that area. Oak Ridge was known for its beautiful Victorian houses and manicured lawns, but it was also a place where he'd faced some uncomfortable situations. Some residents would avoid eye contact, others would grip their purses tighter when they saw him, and a few had even requested different delivery drivers in the past. But Mike never let these experiences change who he was. His grandmother had always told him, "Your character is what you do when nobody's watching." He lived by these words, treating every customer with the same respect and warmth, regardless of how they treated him. The drive to Oak Ridge was peaceful. Mike hummed along to the radio, keeping an eye on his GPS to ensure the pizza would arrive right on time. The streets were lined with towering oak trees, their branches creating natural archways over the road. The houses grew larger and more elaborate as he drove deeper into the neighborhood. His destination was a Victorian-style house with a wraparound porch and carefully tended flower beds. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the entrance. As Mike parked his car and grabbed the delivery bag, he noticed movement behind the curtains. A figure was watching him approach. He took a deep breath, straightened his uniform, and put on his signature smile. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something told him this delivery would be different from the others. Little did he know, this regular Friday night delivery was about to become a moment that would change not just his life, but someone else's too. The doorbell chimed as he pressed it, and he could hear footsteps approaching from inside. The porch light flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows on the welcome mat beneath his feet. In his hands, the pizza was still warm, and the familiar weight of his delivery bag felt oddly comforting. As the door handle began to turn, Mike stood ready to greet another customer with his usual warmth and professionalism, unaware that he was about to face one of the most challenging and ultimately meaningful deliveries of his career. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes narrowed as she looked Mike up and down, her lips pressing into a thin line. The warm porch light that had seemed welcoming moments ago now felt harsh and exposing. "You're late," she said sharply, but Mike's delivery app showed he was actually 3 minutes early. He could feel the weight of her judgment in every glance, but he maintained his professional demeanor, holding the pizza box carefully in both hands. "Good evening, ma'am," Mike replied with his characteristic warmth. "I have your large pepperoni pizza, fresh from the oven." He kept his voice steady and pleasant, just as he would with any other customer. The aroma of freshly baked pizza wafted between them, but it did nothing to soften her expression. Mrs. Thompson's response came quick and cutting. I specifically asked for delivery within 30 minutes. I should have known better than to expect punctuality." Her words carried a weight beyond their surface meaning, and Mike felt his chest tighten slightly. He'd encountered this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. "I can assure you, ma'am, the order was prepared and delivered within our standard time frame," he explained calmly, pointing to the time stamp on the receipt. "Would you like to see the delivery confirmation?" This seemed to agitate her further. "I don't need to see anything. I want to speak to your manager. I'm sure Giovanni's could find more suitable delivery staff." She emphasized the word suitable in a way that made its true meaning crystal clear. The cool evening breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the street. Mike thought about his grandmother's words again, about character showing itself in difficult moments. He took a deep breath and maintained his composure. "Of course, ma'am. You're welcome to contact the store manager. The number is printed on your receipt. Would you like to check your pizza to ensure everything is correct?" His voice remained steady and professional, though his hand gripped the pizza box a little tighter. Mrs. Thompson snatched the receipt from atop the box. "People like you shouldn't be in this neighborhood after dark. It makes everyone uncomfortable." She reached for her purse, pulling out exact change, no tip of course, and practically threw it at him. As Mike carefully counted the money, he noticed something odd about Mrs. Thompson's movements. Her right hand seemed to shake slightly as she held onto the doorframe, and her face appeared uneven, though it was hard to tell if it was just her angry expression. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he asked, genuine concern creeping into his voice despite her behavior. Years of customer service had taught him to read people well, and something didn't seem right. "Don't pretend to care about my well-being," she snapped, but her words came out slightly slurred. "Just take your money and go back to wherever you came from." She attempted to gesture dismissively, but her movement was jerky and uncoordinated. Mike watched as she struggled with the pizza box, her fingers not quite gripping it properly. The box tilted dangerously, and he instinctively reached out to steady it. This simple action earned him another harsh glare, but he noticed her right eye wasn't focusing properly. "I said I don't need your help." Mrs. Thompson tried to step back, but her movements were becoming increasingly unsteady. The pizza box slipped from her grasp, and Mike quickly caught it before it could fall. In that brief moment, he saw something that made his heart race. The right side of her face was definitely drooping now. Despite all her cruel words and actions, Mike's human instinct kicked in. His sister, a nurse at the local hospital, had drilled the signs of stroke into his head during their Sunday dinners. "Fast action saves lives," she always said. Now, standing on this porch with someone who had just treated him with such disdain, those words echoed in his mind. Time seemed to slow down as Mike watched Mrs. Thompson struggle to maintain her balance. The sophisticated facade was crumbling, revealing something far more vulnerable underneath. Her next attempt at speech came out as unintelligible mumbling, and the hand gripping the doorframe began to lose its strength. The decision that faced Mike in that moment would test not just his professional training, but his very character. The woman who had just belittled and dismissed him was clearly in medical distress. The easy choice would be to leave. After all, she had made it clear she didn't want his help. But Mike knew that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one. The porch light cast strange shadows across Mrs. Thompson's face as Mike watched her struggling to maintain her composure. His mind raced back to the countless Sunday dinners with his sister, where she would passionately discuss her work at the emergency room. "Time is brain," she would always say, drilling into him the importance of recognizing stroke symptoms early. Now, standing on this Victorian porch with the pizza box still warm in his hands, those kitchen table lessons suddenly felt intensely real. Mrs. Thompson's face had changed in the past few minutes, subtle at first, but now unmistakable. The right side of her mouth drooped slightly, as if the muscles had forgotten their purpose. Her attempts at angry words came out slurred, like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of cotton. "I told you to." She struggled with the words, her right hand now hanging limply at her side. The transformation from fierce anger to confusion played across her features, and for the first time that evening, Mike saw real fear in her eyes. The mask of superiority had cracked, revealing the vulnerable human being beneath. Mike set the pizza box down on the nearby porch table, his movements careful and deliberate. The evening crickets had started their chorus, creating an oddly peaceful backdrop to this tense moment. A cool breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging from the porch ceiling, their gentle tinkling a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, stepping closer despite her earlier hostility, "I need you to try something for me. Can you raise both your arms up like this?" He demonstrated, lifting his own arms parallel to the ground. The simple test his sister had taught him could confirm his suspicions. She tried to comply, perhaps too confused now to maintain her previous attitude. Her left arm rose normally, but her right arm barely lifted, wavering like a fallen leaf trying to catch the wind. The fear in her eyes grew as she realized something was very wrong with her body. I don't." She attempted to speak, but the words tangled themselves on her tongue. Her knees buckled slightly, and Mike quickly moved to support her, forgetting all about the harsh words she'd spoken just minutes before. This wasn't about their earlier interaction anymore. This was about basic human compassion. The porch swing creaked softly in the background as Mike guided Mrs. Thompson to sit on the nearby bench. Her expensive cardigan was slightly askew, her carefully styled hair coming loose from its tight bun. Up close, he could see her hands trembling, one steady and purposeful, the other shaking with an unnatural rhythm. Mike remembered his sister's voice. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech problems, these are the classic signs. When you see them, every minute counts. The words echoed in his mind as he watched Mrs. Thompson struggle to maintain her dignity even as her body betrayed her. Through the front window, he could see photos on the wall, Mrs. Thompson in happier times, surrounded by what looked like family. A graduation photo, a wedding picture, moments of joy frozen in time. The woman in those photos stood straight and proud, so different from the frightened person sitting before him now. "Everything's going to be okay," he assured her, his voice calm and steady despite the urgency of the situation. He noticed a medical alert bracelet on her wrist, another crucial piece of information that could help the emergency responders. The evening shadows grew longer across the porch as time seemed to slow down, each second feeling like an eternity. Mrs. Thompson's carefully maintained garden was visible from where they sat, rows of roses and hydrangeas standing at attention like silent witnesses. A half-empty watering can stood by the steps, evidence of a normal evening interrupted by the sudden cruelty of fate. The normalcy of the scene made the medical emergency unfolding feel even more surreal. Mike pulled out his phone, knowing that the next few minutes would be crucial. The screen's glow illuminated his determined expression as he prepared to make the call that could save Mrs. Thompson's life. In this moment, all the prejudice and harsh words from earlier seemed to fade away, leaving only two human beings, one in crisis, the other ready to help. He could hear a dog barking in the distance, children laughing somewhere down the street, the normal sounds of a suburban evening continuing unaware of the drama unfolding on this porch. Mrs. Thompson reached out with her good hand, grabbing his arm with surprising strength, her eyes conveying what her words couldn't, a mixture of fear, regret, and desperate need for help. The decision about what to do next was already made in Mike's heart, though the memory of her earlier cruelty was still fresh. Sometimes life presents moments that test not just our training or knowledge, but the very essence of who we are as human beings. This was one of those moments, and Mike knew exactly what he had to do. Without hesitation, Mike dialed 911, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his body. The operator's calm voice came through clearly. 911, what's your emergency? The porch light flickered above them as dark clouds began gathering in the evening sky. I need an ambulance at 1542 Oak Ridge Drive, Mike spoke clearly, remembering the address from his delivery app. I have a woman in her 60s showing signs of a possible stroke. Right side facial drooping, slurred speech, and right arm weakness. His sister would have been proud of how precisely he described the symptoms. Mrs. Thompson tried to wave him away with her good hand, her pride still fighting against accepting help from someone she had treated so poorly just minutes ago. But her resistance was weakening, and the fear in her eyes told a different story from her gestures. The patient is conscious but having difficulty speaking, Mike continued, keeping his voice steady as he spoke to the operator. She's wearing a medical alert bracelet. He gently took Mrs. Thompson's wrist, reading the information to the emergency services. Each detail could be crucial for her treatment. The operator's voice remained professional. Emergency services are on their way. Can you tell me when the symptoms started? Mike glanced at his delivery app, grateful for the timestamp. Approximately 7 minutes ago. I noticed the changes in her speech and face during our interaction. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Mike followed the operator's instructions. Stay with her. Keep her calm. Don't let her eat or drink anything. The wind had picked up, causing the wind chimes to dance more frantically now, their gentle tinkling replaced by an urgent clanging. Mrs. Thompson's carefully maintained flower beds swayed in the strengthening breeze, and a few petals broke free, swirling around the porch like tiny dancers. The scene felt surreal. Just 20 minutes ago, he had been making a routine pizza delivery, and now he was quite possibly holding someone's life in his hands. Help is coming, he assured her, noticing how her shoulders trembled slightly. Whether from fear or the cooling evening air, he couldn't tell. He spotted a light blanket on the porch swing and carefully draped it over her shoulders. Her expression softened slightly at this simple act of kindness. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. The sound seemed to break something in Mrs. Thompson's carefully maintained facade. A tear rolled down her cheek, on the left side, the side still under her control. Her good hand clutched the blanket tightly. Mike kept talking to her, his voice gentle but firm. The ambulance is almost here. You're going to be okay. He noticed a family photo visible through the window, Mrs. Thompson surrounded by what looked like children and grandchildren. Your family will want to know what's happening. Is there someone I should call? She managed to point weakly toward her phone on the small table near the door. Mike retrieved it, and she struggled to unlock it with her working hand. The screen showed a contact labeled My Daughter. With Mrs. Thompson's nod of approval, Mike made the call. The sirens grew louder as he explained the situation to her daughter, who lived just 15 minutes away. The professional calm he had maintained so far nearly cracked when he heard the daughter's voice break with worry, but he kept his tone steady and reassuring. Red and blue lights began to paint the Victorian house in alternating colors, reflecting off the windows and creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The emergency vehicles pulled up to the curb, their bright headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, their questions precise and movements sure. Mike stepped back, watching as they quickly assessed Mrs. Thompson's condition. He provided them with the timeline and symptoms he had observed, remembering every detail from the moment he first noticed something was wrong. Good catch, one of the paramedics said to him as they prepared to transport Mrs. Thompson. Time is crucial with strokes. Your quick action may have made all the difference. The words hung in the air as they carefully helped Mrs. Thompson onto the stretcher. As they wheeled her toward the ambulance, she reached out with her good hand, catching Mike's arm. Her eyes, now clearer than they had been during their earlier interaction, met his. She couldn't speak properly, but the look she gave him said more than words ever could. In that moment, all the prejudice and anger from earlier seemed to dissolve, replaced by something more fundamental, simple human gratitude. The emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos as the ambulance doors swung open. Rain had started to fall, creating a curtain of water that the paramedics rushed through with their precious cargo. Mike had followed in his car, still wearing his pizza delivery uniform, the events of the evening feeling increasingly surreal. Possible stroke patient. Symptoms began approximately 30 minutes ago, the paramedic reported as they wheeled Mrs. Thompson through the automatic doors. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, making her appear even more vulnerable than she had on her porch. Her daughter arrived just moments later, out of breath and worried, having broken every speed limit to get there. Mike stood back, watching the medical team work with precise efficiency. His sister had often described this dance. The rapid assessment, the quick decisions, the race against time. But witnessing it firsthand was different. Each second felt weighted with possibility and consequence. The head doctor, a woman with kind eyes and quick movements, called out orders as they rushed Mrs. Thompson into the treatment area. Get CT scanning ready. We need to determine if it's ischemic or hemorrhagic. The medical terms floated through the air like foreign words in a familiar song. Mrs. Thompson's daughter turned to Mike, her eyes brimming with tears. The paramedics said you recognized the signs. That you called 911 right away. Her voice cracked slightly. they said if you hadn't. She couldn't finish the sentence, but her gratitude hung in the air between them. Mike shifted uncomfortably, remembering the harsh words from earlier that evening. I just did what anyone would do, he said softly, but the daughter shook her head. No, not everyone would have. Especially not after. She paused, and Mike realized Mrs. Thompson must have told her daughter about their initial interaction during previous deliveries. The waiting room clock ticked steadily as they sat together, an unlikely pair brought together by circumstance. The daughter apologized for her mother's behavior, explaining but not excusing it. She wasn't always like this, she said quietly. After Dad died, something in her just hardened, but that's no excuse for how she treated you. Hours passed like molasses, marked only by the squeaking of nurses' shoes on linoleum floors and the occasional announcement over the intercom. The pizza in Mike's car had long since gone cold, forgotten in the drama of the evening. His phone buzzed with messages from work, but Mr. Giovanni, understanding as always, had already told him to take the time he needed. Finally, the doctor emerged, her face carrying good news. We caught it in time, she announced. The clot-busting medication is working. Your mother's showing improvement already. She turned to Mike, her expression serious. Your quick recognition of the symptoms and immediate action made all the difference. Another 30 minutes and we'd be having a very different conversation. Through the treatment room window, they could see Mrs. Thompson lying in bed, looking small against the white hospital sheets. The right side of her face was already showing signs of improvement, and her speech, though still slurred, was becoming clearer. But it was her eyes that showed the biggest change. The hardness from earlier was gone, replaced by something softer, more thoughtful. The daughter stepped into the room first, rushing to her mother's side. Mike watched through the window as Mrs. Thompson's good hand reached up to touch her daughter's face, wiping away tears. Then, unexpectedly, she turned her head toward the window, her eyes meeting Mike's. She gestured weakly, inviting him in. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. The rain outside had settled into a gentle patter against the windows, nature's own lullaby. Mrs. Thompson struggled to speak, her words coming slowly but clearly. I need to tell you something. Mike moved closer to her bed, aware of the daughter's supportive presence nearby. The woman lying in the hospital bed seemed very different from the one who had greeted him with such disdain just hours ago. Her carefully crafted walls had crumbled, leaving behind someone more real, more human. I was wrong, she managed to say, each word carefully formed. So wrong. Thank you for being better than me. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and this time they fell equally on both sides of her face. The moment felt sacred somehow, like witnessing the first light of dawn after a long dark night. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking this moment of transformation. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, and the first hints of morning were starting to paint the sky in gentle colors. Sometimes, Mike realized, the biggest changes in life come disguised as ordinary moments, like a simple pizza delivery on a Friday evening. The next few weeks brought changes as gradual and subtle as the shifting of seasons. Mrs. Thompson's recovery room, once stark and clinical, slowly filled with flowers, cards, and the warmth of regular visitors. The hospital staff came to know Mike, who stopped by after his delivery shifts, still in his work uniform, often bringing the comforting aroma of fresh pizza with him. Each visit peeled away another layer of the walls that had stood between them. One evening, as the setting sun painted the hospital room in warm orange light, Mrs. Thompson shared stories of her late husband. He would have been so ashamed of what I became, she admitted, her voice stronger now, but heavy with regret. Somewhere along the way, I lost myself in grief and fear. The physical therapy sessions were challenging, but they revealed a determination in Mrs. Thompson that surprised everyone except Mike. He had seen that same stubborn spirit in their first encounter, but now it was channeled into healing rather than hatred. Her right side was gradually regaining strength, each small victory celebrated by the unlikely group of supporters she had gathered. You know, she said one afternoon, working carefully to pick up a cup with her recovering hand, I used to sit in my house and see threats everywhere. Every unfamiliar face became an enemy. I never realized I was building my own prison. The cup trembled slightly but didn't fall. Another small victory. Her daughter became a regular presence during these conversations, often bringing homemade cookies that made the hospital room feel more like a living room. She watched her mother's transformation with a mixture of joy and wonder. "It's like getting back the mom I knew when I was little," she confided to Mike one day in the hospital cafeteria. Before fear changed her. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating therapy session. Mrs. Thompson was struggling with a simple writing exercise, the pen refusing to cooperate with her recovering fingers. Tears of frustration welled up in her eyes, but instead of the bitter anger that would have once followed, she looked at Mike and managed a shaky laugh. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons, doesn't it? That evening, she asked Mike to help her with something important. With her daughter's assistance, she logged into her neighborhood's community website. Her fingers, still not fully cooperative, slowly typed out a message. "I need to share something with all of you." What followed was a raw, honest account of her journey, from the prejudiced woman she had been to the person she was becoming. "I almost lost my life," she wrote, "and was saved by someone I had judged unfairly. My stroke taught me that the walls we build to keep others out only imprison ourselves." The post ended with an invitation to an open discussion about prejudice and community at her house once she returned home. The responses began pouring in almost immediately. Some neighbors shared their own stories of confronting bias, while others expressed support for her courage in speaking out. A few admitted to harboring similar fears and prejudices, thanking her for starting this difficult conversation. During her final days in the hospital, Mrs. Thompson received visits from neighbors she had previously avoided. Each conversation seemed to lift another weight from her shoulders. The physical healing was important, but this emotional transformation was something deeper, more fundamental. One quiet afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the window, she turned to Mike with tears in her eyes. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said softly. "That pizza delivery, it wasn't just about saving my life from a stroke. You saved me from something much worse, from living the rest of my days trapped in fear and hatred." The change wasn't just in her words, it showed in small gestures. The way she smiled at the young Hispanic nurse who checked her vitals, how she engaged in conversation with the African-American doctor during rounds. Each interaction was a small step away from her old self and toward something better. As her discharge date approached, Mrs. Thompson began making plans. She wanted to turn her experience into something meaningful, to ensure that her transformation wasn't just a private journey, but a catalyst for change in her community. The woman who had once viewed differences with suspicion was now eager to build bridges of understanding. The sun was setting on her last day in the hospital when she shared her biggest realization with Mike. "We spend so much time afraid of people who are different," she said, watching the colors change in the sky. "But in the end, it's our shared humanity that matters most. Sometimes it takes nearly losing everything to see that clearly." 6 months later, the Victorian house on Oak Ridge Drive looked different somehow. The same flowers bloomed in the garden, the same wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, but there was a warmth about the place that hadn't existed before. The front porch, once a place of confrontation, had become a gathering spot for neighborhood meetings. On this particular Sunday afternoon, the porch was filled with people of all backgrounds sharing stories over slices of Giovanni's pizza. Mrs. Thompson sat in her favorite chair, serving as both host and student, listening more than she spoke. Her recovery had been remarkable, not just physically, but in ways that went far deeper than any medical chart could measure. "You know," she told the gathered group, her voice clear and strong, "that pizza delivery changed everything. Not just because it saved my life, but because it opened my eyes." She looked at Mike, who sat comfortably among the neighbors, no longer in his delivery uniform, but dressed casually for the weekend gathering. Sometimes our greatest teachers come in unexpected moments. The neighborhood had changed too. The community meetings that started in Mrs. Thompson's living room had sparked real conversations about inclusion and understanding. The Oak Ridge Neighborhood Association, once known for its strict regulations, was now focused on building bridges instead of walls. They had even started a mentorship program connecting elderly residents with young people in the community. Mrs. Thompson's daughter watched these changes with joy, often telling people how different her weekly visits were now. "Mom used to sit alone in this house, afraid of the world outside," she shared. "Now I can barely get her to stay home." She wasn't exaggerating. Her mother had become a regular volunteer at the local community center, sharing her story with others who might be trapped in their own prisons of prejudice. The pizza shop had become something of a local legend. Mr. Giovanni proudly displayed a framed article from the local newspaper telling the story of his delivery driver's life-saving intervention. "This is what community means," he would tell customers, pointing to the article. "Breaking bread together, looking out for each other, no matter who we are." One of the most significant changes was visible in the small things. The security cameras that once surveilled every corner of Mrs. Thompson's property were gone, replaced by welcome signs and flower baskets. The no soliciting sign had given way to one that read, "All neighbors welcome." Her garden, once her private retreat, now hosted monthly potluck dinners where dishes from different cultures shared table space. Mike still delivered pizzas in the neighborhood, but now every delivery was an opportunity for connection. Other residents who had once viewed him with suspicion greeted him warmly, often sharing updates about their lives or asking about his sister's nursing work. The ripples of change spread far beyond one house on Oak Ridge Drive. Mrs. Thompson had started a journal documenting her journey, not just of physical recovery, but of spiritual and emotional healing. "It's strange," she wrote, "how a moment that could have been my end became my new beginning. Sometimes the very people we push away are the ones who save us, not just from illness, but from ourselves." The local church had asked her to speak about her experience, and though public speaking had never been her forte, she agreed. Her message was simple but powerful. Change is possible at any age. Our prejudices are not who we are, they're what we can overcome. The standing room only crowd that day included people from all walks of life, drawn by the authenticity of her transformation. Even the pizza delivery route had changed. Other drivers in the area, inspired by Mike's story, had started paying more attention to their elderly customers, checking in on them during deliveries. What began as one man's compassionate response to a medical emergency had evolved into a community-wide commitment to looking out for each other. As the Sunday gathering wound down, Mrs. Thompson pulled Mike aside. "You know what I've learned?" she said, watching the diverse group of people chatting on her porch. "Life doesn't give us many chances to completely rewrite our story. But when it does, we better grab that chance with both hands." The setting sun cast long shadows across the porch, but unlike that fateful evening 6 months ago, these shadows held no fear. They were just part of the natural rhythm of a day ending and another beginning, much like Mrs. Thompson's own journey from darkness to light. As the neighbors said their goodbyes, each heading home with leftover pizza and renewed spirit, Mrs. Thompson stood on her porch, waving. The wind chimes played their gentle song, and somewhere in the distance, a delivery car headed out with its red light glowing, carrying not just food, but the possibility of connection to someone else's door.